thought a lot about whether I should bother to make this video and whether it's worth the grief. I've very much angled my channel away from political and social commentary and things for quite some time, and recently when there were big events that I felt I couldn't ignore, that I commented on, that were political, there was a considerable backlash to that, even though such videos are labelled so they're not the same as the rest of the content. I'm aware that I do YouTube wrong and I don't have split out channels for all the different things that I do or talk about, but such is the state of things. But a couple of things have kind of prompted me to think about making this video. And I've never really considered myself a men's rights activist, much as that gets thrown around a lot, but more an egalitarian who is concerned primarily with men's issues, because I am a man and I've been at the sharp end of a lot of this stuff over my life, but merely seeming to want fairness or equality in things seems to be treated as hostility to feminism rather than something that is complementary to feminism. And by feminism here I mean the pursuit of equality, so it should be in line with egalitarianism. However, I've run into a couple of things recently that have prompted me, I suppose. The video from a couple of years ago about the alleged alt-right in tabletop, one of the accusations sort of levelled at me was that I was an MRA. Now, I think there are people in that space that do good, but I haven't wanted to be associated with it necessarily because of the toxicity of a lot of it. It's unfortunate, but in order to get attention, it seems you have to be pretty toxic. I think that says something about the state of social media and media in general. But yeah, the accusations were in there, but it's not something I've ever considered myself to be. I had my, what do they call it in MRA circles? Red pill rage moments back in the day a bit, when you sort of suddenly become aware of the problems. You know, lots of people who become activists in whatever the case might be become particularly fervent the moment they become aware of the issues or are convinced that there's an issue and overdo it. And yeah, that was me back at the start. The other thing is TikTok, which seems to have become the cesspool that Tumblr has transferred to via Twitter in terms of trying to discuss these sorts of issues. And that's really unfortunate, I think. It seems to be yet another thing that is polarizing people into extremes rather than bringing them together to share perspectives and ideas and to discuss, despite TikTok having a sort of reply or whatever they call it, duet function, which you would think would facilitate conversation in the same way that YouTube used to, but no. I mean, enough beating about the bush. In recent years, there has been a growing conversation about misogyny in the United Kingdom, and just recently, the new Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has announced a crackdown on misogynistic behaviour and communication. And this might include potential legislation to combat it. Under British law, there is an ethical and legal requirement to apply the law evenly across the genders, ensuring that no group is being unfairly targeted nor unfairly ignored. Yet, while efforts to address this sort of high-profile misogyny, the likes of Andrew Tate and so on, are increasing, there is little to no attention being paid to Misandry, the hatred or prejudice towards men. And I made a comment on this basis on TikTok, and the comments in reply to mine were, as you can probably guess, rife with misandry. Misandry doesn't exist. Where are women murdering multiple men, as if murder is the only way in which prejudice can manifest itself. Just outright denial, a lot of self-loathing men who will doubtless turn out to be sex offenders in the years to come. that sort of thing. But it is depressing, exhausting, and profoundly dishonest. But that is the prevailing attitude. Misandry is often dismissed or trivialized in what passes for public discourse, with many viewing it as non-existent, laughable, or as some sort of reactionary concept used to deflect from more pressing issues of misogyny. However, to ignore misandry is to engage in misandry. It is to overlook a significant and harmful form of bias that affects men in various ways. If we are to accept terms and qualifiers when it comes to misogyny, such as institutional, systemic, and internalized, then they should apply evenly when it comes to misandry, and these are largely the ways in which misandry manifests itself in our society. These terms highlight the ways in which prejudice against men is actually woven into the fabric of our society, influencing everything from legal systems to cultural norms that we hold each other to. And while it matters to some people, this next thing, even though it probably shouldn't, I am talking from personal experience to a large extent here. I would have liked to have been a primary school teacher. However, the suspicion that is laid at the feet of men who want to get into teaching, especially primary or introductory teaching, it's overwhelming and negative. And I think that is part of the reason why there are so many less men in primary education, because there is this massive degree of suspicion and presumption and other issues that goes along with it. Now, obviously, you want people to be safe, to be around kids, and a certain degree of scrutiny is there, but it's excessive, I would say. The UK's mental health system is not really set up to cater to men. I suffer from suicidal depression, general anxiety, and generally speaking, much as I love the NHS, it hasn't been fit for purpose when it comes to men's mental health at all. They have a one-size-fits-all approach. They don't offer things that are better for men when it comes to mental health support. You're an afterthought. Other people get prioritization, and so that leads into the negative outcomes for a lot of men. I've lost people I've known to substance abuse, behaviors that are extremely risky, suicide, mental health crises that have left people ruined, and there's nothing much I can do about it. I privately mentor a few people with the same struggles that I have, but given that I struggle, I don't think that I can really help that much. But the point is, I've been at the sharp end. I've been a victim of it. I've seen other people be victims of it, and I've seen people lose their lives because of it, and that's what motivates me to still, against all the slings and arrows, talk out about it. While the focus on misogyny often centres on high-profile cases, such as the tragic murders of Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, for example, misandry is rarely given the same attention, as it's more of a sort of general background radiation to life that we seem to have become habituated to. It doesn't tend to be as showy as alleged incel spree killings and similar, or human trafficking accusations made against former reality stars. It's just not as salacious and headline grabby as murder and other nastiness. However, the existence of misandry is evident societally. Occasionally it even is showy in the same way, if we consider the actions of individuals like Valerie Salinas, who famously wrote the Scum Manifesto and shot Andy Warhol. She advocated for the elimination of men. Or there's Eileen Wuornos, a serial killer who exclusively targeted men consistently because of her hatred. These examples are often dismissed as outliers, but they underscore the potential for extreme anti-male sentiment, most of which, as with misogyny, doesn't rise to the level of murder and so on, but is nonetheless present. High-profile cases miss the broader and more pervasive issues of misandry in society. For example, female genital mutilation, FGM, is rightly targeted by the laws of the UK, but male circumcision, which also involves the removal of genital tissue from non-consenting children, is not similarly addressed. Yes, while harmful, it's less harmful than some forms of FGM, but it is still harmful and can go horribly wrong, especially if done in the various traditional manners that some faiths and so on have. It is adhered to for exactly the same excuses, the same religious and cultural reasons as FGM, but that's not an excuse that makes us turn a blind eye to female genital mutilation, and the milder forms of FGM are approximately analogous or even less harmful than the forms of male genital mutilation. This disparity in approach and consideration reflects a broader societal trend where issues that affect men are often minimized, excused, or ignored, whereas the same or similar issues that affect women are given enormous priority. Men, it seems, are expected to simply tolerate or tough out the things that are done to them, and this is a form of misandry. Men and boys are also struggling in education, with boys consistently underperforming compared to girls and seen as unruly and disruptive. Despite this, there remains a significant amount of support still available for women and girls right through education, from entry all the way through to university, while similar support for men is sorely lacking, even though at this point men and boys are doing much worse in education. Yet despite this reality, men and boys are assumed to be doing fine, or to still be privileged in the same sense that they were 50 or 60 years ago. We punish boys today for the state of affairs a lifetime ago, a hideous form of secular original sin. And the reality of the current modern situation doesn't seem to factor into what we do. In the criminal justice system, men receive harsher and longer sentences for the same crimes compared to women, or women get shorter and lighter sentences depending which way you want to look at it. Either way, this highlights a systemic bias that disadvantages men. Interestingly, this is not the case when the judge is female and the accused is female. You can characterize this as misogyny if you want, the soft bigotry of low expectations, or benevolent sexism, or you can characterize it as misandry, the hatred of men and the assumption that they're worse or more recidivist or whatever else. But why not both? Why not include misogyny and misandry when considering these things? The lack of specialized healthcare for men is another area of concern. While women's health issues are continually prioritized, men's health, particularly men's mental health, is often overlooked. This despite the fact that men die by their own hand at 3 to 4 times the rate that women do. Mental health approaches, especially those available publicly through the NHS, are often less suited to men, centered around talk therapy, issues like that. So the treatment available is often less suited to men, less effective with men, or not even offered to men, or men, such as myself, give up our places for women because we're not getting anything from what we're being offered. Despite the fact that men are the overwhelming majority of victims of violence, public policy and funding continues to prioritize violence against women and girls, leaving men to be brutalized, injured, and killed, and often to turn into perpetrators themselves as they go ignored by the system. When we turn a blind eye to that, that is also a form of misandry. Men are more likely, half again as likely, as women to suffer from random street violence compared to women, but how many people actually know that? How many people know that 3 men for every 2 women are subject to some form of public assault? Yet it is the safety of women and girls that we continue to prioritize, even though they're the minority of victims, leaving men to take the overwhelming brunt and never seeking to address it because, apparently, manifesting this misandry, we just assume the worst of men, all men, and that nothing can be done to change behavior, protect them, or to address violence against or by men, and this is a form of misandry. Nearly as many men are victims of domestic violence as women, and if you take into account underreporting and wider definitions of intimate partner violence, it's almost certainly 50-50. Yet domestic violence services often operate under the assumption that the male partner is the perpetrator, not the victim, in standard relationships, obviously. There are almost no shelter places for men. Even if we take the low estimate that maybe a third as many men are victims, there's still almost no shelter places, nowhere near a third the number of places that women have. Male victims are not allowed into female-oriented shelters, which is fair enough to the extent that it's fair enough, but it leaves them nowhere to go. And this often leaves male victims and their children vulnerable. Sometimes, because there is nowhere for them to go, men are forced to either leave their children with an abusive partner who may be abusive to the children, or to stay and continue to take the abuse so that they can be there for their children. When they've had to leave, this has sometimes had tragic consequences because the children have been left exposed to the abusive partner to take the brunt of it. Domestic violence against men is somehow seen as funny, ridiculous, or excusable. Oh, what did he do? This is another form of misandry. Furthermore, homelessness is a significant issue for men, with men making up the majority of the rough sleeping population. 3/4 to 4/5 of the rough sleeping population is men. Despite this, again, much of the support and resources for the homeless remain targeted towards the much smaller minority of women and girls who are out on the street, leaving vulnerable men subject to abuse and exploitation and an almost inevitable run-in with the law. And this disparity in how seriously we treat these things is another form of misandry. There's also a pervasive mistrust of men around young children, despite the fact that, for example, women are responsible for the majority of infanticide cases. Does this mean that all women should be kept away from all infants? Obviously not. That would be ridiculous, and it's just as ridiculous to assume that a man is a threat or a paedophile without any sort of justification, and yet we do. There is a clear disparity in treatment here, and it's not fact-led. So this too is a form of misandry. The rise in misogyny in recent years can be likened to the causes of the race riots recently in the UK, where a group that feels left behind and is assumed to be benefiting from privilege begins to lash out. Nobody talks to them, nobody shows that they care about their issues, except charlatans, hustlers, and hate-mongers. Just as racism has been tackled in the past by addressing the underlying causes, the deprivation. In the aftermath of the Battle of Cable Street, the government focused on improving housing and access to services, and that helped neuter the threat of Mosley's racists. But there remains a need to address these causes of misogyny by also considering how misandry is impacting men, how men are failing in society and being failed by society in the here and now, and how we can improve their lives and treat them equally with the same seriousness that we treat women's issues. The longer we don't address the issues that men have, the more space, the more room there is for misogyny to flourish, because it's always easy to blame someone for your problems, whether it's women or whether it's racial minorities, and the rest of us just aren't in the conversation, and we need to be. Figures like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson have capitalized on the growing discontent amongst young men, exploiting their vulnerabilities to push misogynistic, traditionalistic, far-right and regressive ideas. And they have no meaningful opposition. Nobody on, broadly speaking, the left bothers to speak to disaffected men other than to blame them and demonize them. God knows I'm not egotistical enough to think I'm the one to do it, but it needs to happen. The previously mentioned misandry makes men susceptible to this kind of hate preaching, as they feel increasingly alienated, left behind, ignored, left to hang by mainstream society. And these figures are the only ones talking to them. You can see a similar analogy in how Donald Trump secured support from the white working class in America, causing them to vote against their own interests, by talking about and to their problems. He wasn't going to do anything about it, but the pretense of taking an interest was more than they'd had in a long time. The only other person talking to that group at all was Bernie Sanders, and he got attacked by his own side. Bernie bros. To effectively combat both misandry and misogyny, we need to address the ways in which men are being failed by society. This would include things like banning circumcision, implementing fairer sentencing guidelines that do not disproportionately punish men, or disproportionately let women off. Provide more support in education to help boys, specifically, succeed in modern, feminized learning environments, ways that better suit them. Additionally, there needs to be more specialized healthcare for men, especially in the area of mental health. And more support, given that there's virtually none, that shouldn't be difficult, for male survivors of domestic violence and abuse. We should start by recognizing that female rape of men is something that happens, and we should be able to prosecute it in law, something we currently cannot do because the legal definition of rape in this country does not include what women can do to men. Yeah, things are that biased. By making these sorts of changes, we can create a society in which men and women are treated genuinely equally and proportionately under the law and socially, and where the needs of both genders are recognised and addressed and not treated as a zero-sum game, which is how modern activist feminism and online feminism has tended to treat it. This is not just about helping men, it's about creating a more just and equitable society for everyone and removing reasons for people to indulge in prejudice. A rising tide lifts all ships, and by addressing misandry, you necessarily also address misogyny. The discussion of misogyny is necessary and important, but it must be balanced with an understanding of how misandry also affects society. By addressing the systemic issues that contribute to misandry, we can help prevent the rise of misogyny, cut out the grifters, and create a society where all individuals, regardless of gender, are treated fairly and with respect. The time has come to recognise and address misandry with the same seriousness, rigour, and vigour as we do misogyny, ensuring that the law and society itself protect and support everyone equally. Of course, I don't think this is going to happen. This is massively unorthodox, holistic societal thinking. It's unfashionable. It's still cool to hate on men, to blame them for all the ills of the world, same as it was a decade or more ago. It's just metastasized from Tumblr to Twitter and now to TikTok. So I'm under no illusions that me saying any of this will make any difference or change anything in any positive way. Probably quite the opposite. But at least it's something, right? You may now feel free to quibble, excuse, and make accusations in the comments. Zang.
Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?
Murder me and fuck my skull. Put my body in a vat of acid. Put my brain into a jar. Show it to your friends.